She said I'd changed. I said pain changes people. But neither of us expected how much we'd change each other. The first moment they saw each other again was almost cinematic in its simplicity. He hadn't expected to find her in that quiet corner cafe, tucked away between shelves of books and the soft glow of hanging lights. Yet there she was, 40, poised, gracefully carrying herself with the kind of confidence that only comes with years of navigating life's complexities. There was a subtle elegance in the way she adjusted her scarf, a flicker of a smile that hinted at a humor reserved only for herself, and yet her eyes carried a vulnerability he hadn't noticed before. He froze for a moment, caught between the pull of recognition and the hesitance born of uncertainty. Time had etched lines on her face, but they weren't signs of age. They were markers of experience, of laughter and pain lived fully. He noticed how the sunlight hit her hair just so, turning streaks of brown into soft, golden highlights. She looked up at him then, and in that instant, there was a silent acknowledgement of shared history, a fleeting recognition that both of them had changed in ways only the other could perceive. Their greeting was tentative. The handshake lingered just a second too long, a small spark of warmth igniting where their fingers brushed. It was neither overt nor accidental. It was simply a subtle acknowledgement that despite time, something unspoken still tethered them together. He felt a flicker of something he hadn't expected, nervousness. Yes, but also a strange comfort, as if being in her presence reminded him of a version of himself he had almost forgotten. The cafe itself seemed to fade into the background. The gentle clinking of cups, the low hum of conversation, and the rich scent of brewed coffee became a quiet soundtrack to this reunion. He noticed how she sipped her tea, deliberately, slowly, as though savoring not just the taste but the act of being present. She glanced at him, and there was a softness in her gaze, an invitation for him to enter her space without fear of judgment. He realized he was observing every small detail. The way her fingers curled around the cup, the slight tilt of her head, the micro-expressions that betrayed both confidence and a hidden fragility. His own posture had shifted too. He was leaning slightly forward, almost unconsciously, drawn toward her warmth, toward the familiarity that was both comforting and disarming. There was no need for immediate words. Their silence carried meaning. In that pause, he reflected on how pain had changed him, how the weight of past experiences had altered the way he moved through the world. And in the same instant, he sensed that she too had been shaped by her own trials. Both of them had been tempered by life, and now, in this small, sunlit cafe, that shared transformation was palpable, almost electric. Their eyes met again, lingering longer than polite conversation demanded. A quiet, unspoken tension settled between them, gentle yet charged. A slow-burning curiosity, an acknowledgement of a bond neither of them could yet define. This encounter was more than coincidence. It was the beginning of a journey, a subtle awakening of emotions that neither time nor distance had managed to erase. The conversation began casually, almost cautiously. They sat across from each other, a small table between them, cups of coffee steaming gently in the soft cafe light. Words about work, mutual acquaintances, and everyday life filled the air. But beneath the surface, each sentence carried layers of unspoken meaning. He noticed the subtle way she listened, tilting her head slightly, eyes tracing his movements, not with judgment, but with quiet curiosity. She had always been perceptive, but now, there was an added depth in her gaze, as if she could see not only who he had become, but also the shadows of the struggles he had endured. He realized immediately that she had changed too, not in ways that were obvious like new hairstyles or fashion choices, but in the way she held herself. Her posture was straighter, yet relaxed, radiating confidence that wasn't forced. Her laugh, soft and melodic, carried a tinge of restraint, as though she had learned the delicate art of protecting herself while still remaining approachable. Every small gesture, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the faint upward curve of her lips, spoke of maturity and quiet self-assurance. He caught himself studying the subtle changes in her hands, the way they moved when she spoke, how they sometimes lingered on the table, almost inviting him to notice their warmth. The slightest brush of her fingers against hers as she reached for her cup sent a small ripple of awareness through him, a reminder that even after time and distance, some connections remained undeniable. He felt an unfamiliar mix of admiration, longing, and caution, aware that while she had grown in confidence, her vulnerability had not disappeared. It was now more nuanced, more carefully guarded. The rain began tapping lightly against the window, creating a soft rhythm that seemed to mirror the quiet tension in the room. Each pause in their conversation felt deliberate, each glance weighted with significance. He caught himself remembering moments from their past. Shared jokes, unspoken confessions, times when silence had spoken louder than words ever could. Now, those memories were filtered through the lens of their changed selves, adding a bittersweet texture to every interaction. She laughed at a small anecdote he shared, and he noticed how the corners of her eyes crinkled in a way that made her appear both approachable and distant at the same time. He realized he was listening more than he had in years, noticing inflections in her voice, the rhythm of her breathing, the way she occasionally paused to search for the right words. He had always been observant, but now, he understood that she had become just as attuned to him, reading the subtle signs of his altered demeanor, sensing the pain he carried without needing it to be spoken aloud. By the end of their meeting, the casual conversation had evolved into something far more profound. The recognition of their mutual changes, the visible, the hidden, the emotional, had created an invisible thread between them. A connection that was no longer simply rooted in past familiarity, but in the careful, deliberate understanding of each other's present selves. Their eyes met one last time before parting, lingering longer than politeness allowed. In that gaze, both acknowledged the undeniable truth. They were no longer the same people who had once known each other. Yet, in that very change, there was a fragile, compelling hope, an unspoken possibility that perhaps their altered selves could still find a way to connect, carefully, slowly, meaningfully. The rain outside had grown heavier, drumming gently against the cafe windows, yet inside, there was a comforting warmth, a cocoon where the world outside seemed to fade. He noticed the way she shifted in her seat, a subtle sigh escaping her lips as she set down her cup. For the first time, the guarded walls she had carried with her began to soften, and he realized he was witnessing a side of her few others ever saw, quiet vulnerability beneath her polished exterior. He found himself leaning slightly forward, compelled to listen, to understand, to offer silent reassurance. Words about mundane routines slowly gave way to confessions of fatigue, moments of doubt, and subtle fears she had long carried alone. There was no drama in her voice, no plea for sympathy, just honesty, delivered with a strength that made him ache quietly. He understood, in an instant, how life had sculpted her resilience and tempered her grace with shadows of struggle. As she spoke, his own defenses began to lower. He spoke of his own pain too, not in grandiose terms, but in honest fragments. Nights spent awake with restless thoughts, moments of hesitation in relationships, the quiet ache of experiences that had reshaped him. His words were careful, hesitant, yet they carried the weight of sincerity. She listened intently, her gaze never wavering, and when he paused, she reached out, brushing her fingertips briefly against his hand. The contact was fleeting, almost accidental, yet it conveyed a world of empathy and connection. He noticed the small details, how the light glinted off her eyes as she looked at him, the faint tremor in her lips when she spoke of loss, the gentle rise and fall of her shoulders as she exhaled deeply. Each subtle gesture anchored him, drawing him closer without words. He was aware of his own reactions too, the softening of his posture, the conscious slowing of his breath, the way his fingers twitched with the desire to reach for her hand again, to offer comfort through touch alone. The cafe around them existed in a blur, the hum of conversation, the clink of spoons against mugs, the smell of coffee mingling with the faint scent of rain. But within that space, a fragile intimacy had formed. In the silence between sentences, in the shared looks and accidental touches, there was a dialogue deeper than anything they could have spoken aloud. Pain had changed them both, but here, in this quiet corner, it also created a bridge, a way to connect through the honesty of their vulnerabilities. By the time they prepared to leave, the atmosphere between them had shifted. There was a new layer of trust, fragile yet undeniable, and an unspoken acknowledgement that their connection had deepened. His hand brushed hers as they gathered their belongings, and this time, the touch lingered a fraction longer, intentional, meaningful. Neither spoke of it, but both felt the charge, the silent understanding that this encounter had altered something within them. As they stepped out into the rain, their shared glance held more than recognition. It held empathy, warmth, and the first faint stirrings of a bond that could grow into something far more profound. For the first time, he realized that vulnerability wasn't a weakness. It was a doorway, and together, they had taken the first careful step through it. The warmth of their previous conversation still lingered like a soft echo, but the next meeting brought an unexpected tension that neither of them had anticipated. They had arranged to meet at the same quiet cafe, but this time, the air between them felt heavier, as if unspoken words and past misunderstandings were pressing down, making each gesture more deliberate, each glance more scrutinized. He noticed it first, the slight stiffening of her shoulders as she approached, the way her eyes darted momentarily before meeting his. She seemed more guarded than before, a subtle hesitation in the tilt of her head, as though preparing herself for a conversation that could reveal too much or demand more than either of them was ready to give. He, in turn, felt a familiar tightness in his chest, a pulse of anxiety that reminded him how deeply he cared, how invested he had become, even before clarity had fully formed. Their conversation began innocently, touching on daily life, work pressures, and mutual acquaintances. But as the discussion moved toward more personal terrain, the protective walls each had built began to show cracks. A comment he made, intended as a light observation, was misinterpreted, and he saw the flicker of hurt in her eyes. Her lips pressed together, and her gaze momentarily dropped, a subtle signal of disappointment or frustration. He tried to clarify, to soften the words, but found himself grappling with the weight of his own hesitations, the lingering remnants of past pain that made vulnerability feel risky. She responded carefully, choosing words that were precise, almost measured, but beneath the surface, there was emotion, disappointment, longing, and perhaps fear of being hurt again. He felt a pang of guilt and the sharp sting of awareness that despite their growing connection, neither of them was immune to miscommunication. They were still learning each other, still navigating the fragile terrain between attraction, trust, and emotional scars. Amid the verbal tension, physical cues carried as much weight as the dialogue. A hand brushed briefly against the table, stopping just short of touching his. He noticed the slight tremor in her fingers. Her posture alternated between leaning slightly toward him and retreating, signaling both interest and caution. He, too, found himself shifting, leaning in, pulling back, searching for balance between empathy and self-protection. The rain outside mirrored the mood inside, each tap against the window a reminder of the world beyond their quiet storm of emotions. For a few moments, words failed them entirely. Silence stretched, uncomfortable yet laden with unspoken meaning. Then, slowly, their expressions softened, acknowledging the shared reality, that they cared enough to feel hurt, enough to hesitate, and enough to stay despite the tension. A fleeting touch, a hand moving slightly closer, a shoulder brushing gently, served as a silent olive branch, a bridge over the miscommunication. By the time the conversation ended, the conflict had not fully resolved, but it had transformed. Instead of retreating completely, they recognized the depth of the bond they were building, fragile though it was. They left the cafe with a heightened awareness of each other, hearts slightly heavier but undeniably more attuned. Pain had changed them both, but it was also teaching them the delicate art of navigating intimacy. The hesitation, the vulnerability, and the small, meaningful gestures that hinted at trust and longing even amidst conflict. After the subtle storm of their previous meeting, today's encounter carried a different energy, softer, warmer, and tinged with the quiet relief of reconciliation. They met again at a small, familiar cafe, where the aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint scent of rain lingering on the streets outside. The space felt intimate and safe, a gentle refuge where both could allow themselves to be present without pretense. He arrived first, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly as he anticipated her arrival. When she appeared, he immediately noticed the delicate shift in her demeanor. There was a lightness in her step, a relaxed curve in her shoulders, as if the tension from their last encounter had softened overnight. She smiled, a quiet, knowing smile that didn't need words to convey acknowledgement, apology, and mutual understanding all at once. That small gesture alone eased the lingering tightness in his chest. Their conversation began with casual remarks, playful anecdotes about daily routines, and small laughter that felt effortless. But beneath the surface, a deeper emotional connection quietly emerged. He noticed how her hand occasionally hovered near his as she reached for her cup, subtle movements that hinted at trust and comfort. When their fingers brushed, neither pulled away. Instead, a small warmth spread through him, gentle and grounding, as if her presence alone could settle the remnants of yesterday's conflict. He observed the small ways she sought connection. The tilt of her head when listening intently, the faint crease between her brows when she concentrated, and the way her eyes softened when she laughed. Each of these gestures told him more than words ever could, revealing not just her grace and strength, but also the quiet vulnerabilities she had chosen to share with him. In response, he found himself mirroring her openness, leaning slightly closer, letting his body language convey the same subtle reassurance she was offering. At one point, a minor mishap, a spilled spoon, a slightly tipped cup, led to shared laughter. The simplicity of the moment broke any lingering tension completely. He reached instinctively to steady the cup, and their hands met briefly. The touch lingered a fraction longer than necessary, deliberate yet understated, a small acknowledgement of shared comfort and growing intimacy. Neither felt the need to speak of it. The warmth of the gesture said everything. Outside, the rain had softened to a gentle drizzle, casting a reflective glow on the streets, mirroring the reflective mood within. He noticed how her eyes followed the movement of raindrops on the window pane, thoughtful yet relaxed, and he felt a desire to protect that quiet serenity, to ensure she felt seen and appreciated. In turn, her small gestures, resting her hand lightly on his forearm, offering a smile that lingered, spoke volumes about the trust they were rebuilding. By the time they parted, there was a renewed sense of connection. The tension from past misunderstandings had been replaced by a warmth that was both tender and steady. They walked away with the knowledge that vulnerability, when met with care and attention, could strengthen rather than break a bond. Pain had shaped them, yes, but shared comfort, gentle understanding, and meaningful presence had begun to create a space where emotional intimacy could grow, subtly, naturally, and beautifully. The air between them that day felt different, charged yet tender, fragile yet inviting. They had agreed to meet at the same quiet cafe, but today the space seemed smaller, more intimate, as if it were drawing them closer together. The muted light, the faint scent of coffee, and the soft patter of rain against the windows formed a backdrop to a moment that had been slowly building for weeks. Both of them were acutely aware of the weight of their unspoken feelings, the careful dance between longing and hesitation that had defined their interactions so far. He noticed first the subtle tremor in her fingers as she set down her cup, the brief flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. There was no need for words yet. Her presence alone communicated the depth of what she felt, a mixture of affection, uncertainty, and quiet yearning. He leaned slightly forward, unconsciously closing the space between them, drawn by the magnetic pull of shared history and the bond that had grown through laughter, silence, and gentle touches. Their conversation began in familiar tones, speaking of life, work, and the small routines that framed their days. But gradually, the edges softened, the words became more deliberate, more personal. He spoke carefully, allowing glimpses of the pain he had endured, of nights spent questioning himself, and of the subtle changes in his heart and mind that had shaped who he had become. She listened, her gaze unwavering, her hand brushing lightly against his as if to anchor him, to reassure him that he was not alone. Her turn came slowly, words chosen with care, revealing the depth of her own struggles and the silent battles she had fought while maintaining her composed exterior. He watched as her shoulders relaxed slightly, as her eyes glistened with an unspoken honesty, and he felt the weight of her vulnerability settle gently on his heart. In that moment, he realized how deeply he had come to care for her, not just for her beauty or her charm, but for the intricate layers of strength, vulnerability, and grace that defined her. Then came the first intentional touch, a soft, deliberate brush of her fingers against his, lingering longer than casual politeness required. It was electric in its subtlety, a wordless confession, an intimate acknowledgement that they had both been changed by one another. He responded instinctively, his hand moving to rest gently near hers, almost grazing, almost entwining, and in that near contact, everything shifted. The silence that followed was heavy with meaning, a shared understanding that words could not fully capture. Finally, he spoke, the simplest, most honest words he could offer, a confession of care, of longing, and of the recognition that their lives had become irrevocably intertwined. Her response was immediate yet soft, a mirrored confession that acknowledged not only his feelings, but also the quiet, persistent pull she had felt toward him for weeks. As the rain outside softened to a gentle drizzle, they sat close, hands near, shoulders almost touching, the subtle warmth between them speaking louder than any dialogue could. In that moment, the slow-burn tension that had defined their relationship gave way to clarity. Vulnerability had become connection, longing had become acknowledgement, and the past pain that had shaped them had also opened the doorway to love. Part 7 Resolution, expanded. The rain had finally ceased, leaving the streets glistening with reflections of city lights and the faint scent of wet earth. They found themselves walking side by side, shoulders almost brushing, in a quiet park that felt removed from the hum of the world. The weight of the past weeks, the miscommunications, the confessions, the tender touches, hung between them like a delicate thread, taut but unbroken. There was a newfound ease in their movements, a rhythm that spoke of familiarity, yet carried the fresh excitement of something more. He glanced at her, noticing the subtle way she had shifted her weight, the gentle curve of her smile, and the calm grace in the way she moved. The moments of conflict and vulnerability they had shared now seemed like necessary steps, each one layering trust and understanding into their connection. He realized how much he had come to rely on her presence, how her mere nearness had become a source of comfort, grounding him in a way nothing else had. She caught his gaze and returned it with quiet warmth, a softness in her eyes that mirrored his own. Their hands found each other naturally, fingers intertwining almost instinctively, and the touch was both grounding and electric, a simple acknowledgement of the bond they had nurtured. It was a touch without urgency, gentle yet deliberate, carrying the weight of weeks of shared laughter, silence, and unspoken understanding. They paused by a small fountain, the water sparkling in the low light, and he felt a sense of calm settle over him. Here, in this shared silence, there was no need for grand declarations. The emotional distance that had once existed had dissolved, replaced by a steady intimacy that didn't demand explanation. They simply existed in the same space, breathing the same air, and in that proximity the depth of their connection was clear. Her voice broke the silence softly, sharing a small reflection on the past and the unexpected ways their lives had intersected. He listened, captivated not just by her words but by the vulnerability and honesty in the way she spoke. He responded with equal openness, acknowledging his own growth, the ways she had changed him, and the subtle shift in his heart that had been occurring since their first encounter. Their conversation flowed effortlessly, a blend of reflection, gratitude, and quiet humor, a natural dance of two souls who had come to understand each other deeply. As the evening progressed, they found a bench beneath a softly glowing lamppost. Sitting close, shoulders brushing, they shared a small laugh over a private joke, the sound light and genuine. He felt the warmth of her hand against his, the subtle pressure of fingers lacing together, and in that moment, the slow-burn tension that had defined their journey melted into certainty. They had arrived at a place of emotional security, a connection forged through vulnerability, empathy, and the courage to acknowledge their feelings. Standing to leave, they shared a lingering glance, a gentle squeeze of the hand, and a quiet, meaningful smile. No words were necessary, their bond was clear. As they walked side by side into the evening, there was a sense of completion, yet also of possibility. Pain had changed them both, yes, but it had also prepared them to recognize, nurture, and cherish the love they had found in each other. In that shared quiet, they were together, and for the first time, truly secure in the knowledge that their connection could endure, quietly but profoundly, into the future.